biggest issues with transformation is our lack of understanding of how change scales. So on one hand, most of the approaches to change are top down, where maybe we assume that we set some sort of direction on high. We then gather people around us that support that initiative. We create a strategy around it. We communicate that strategy. We then implement the strategy and measure against the strategy. It's top down. It's forcing change down. Again, we know that very often that's unsuccessful. In fact, the statistics show that most transformation fails. The second problem, I think, is our lack of understanding of how change actually does happen in reality. So, for example, if you look at a lot of the very largest change initiatives globally that have happened sort of across society, so that might be the likes of civil rights, single-sex marriage, maybe the Me Too movement, etc., they all start locally. They don't start centrally. They don't start from high. They start locally on the ground. There's a great saying, is it John McNeice would have said, that things like the civil rights, etc., really started street by street, block by block, building by building, room by room. And what happens is it contagious from the local outwards. That ties in very nicely with work by Damien Centola, how change happens, and Damien would have spoken about two different types of contagion. There's simple contagion and there's complex contagion. So if you look at simple contagion, an example is maybe how a virus spreads or contagious. It moves just from one person to another, from the very activity of being close or to someone else. So an example, as I say, might be COVID. On the other hand, something like the wearing of masks during COVID is an example of a complex contagion. It doesn't just simply spread from one person to another. There's a deliberation element. Each individual needs to make a decision. And in those cases, what we find is that we tend to do and we tend to put more weight on what those around us are doing, those that are most similar to us. So I know Damien talks about maybe examples of Kim Kardashian, that when it comes to maybe and other influencers, that very often they can be effective maybe in transferring information, but they tend to be far less effective in terms of disseminating behavior change. We tend to change our behavior more in line with what others local to us do than a Kim Kardashian, etc. So where does that bring us? And I suppose it then brings us back to this idea of transformation. So if you are trying to create change from within an organization, we know that those that are most senior in an organization have most vested interest in the status quo. They're less likely to change. It's the same with maybe influencers that are in the middle of a network. They have more to lose, so they tend to be more discerning before adopting change. Okay, so very often those at the apex or those at the center of networks are less likely to change. There's also another issue. If you're at the center of a network, the apex of an organization, you're in a denser population. You've more people around you. Now, we know for behavior change, there tends to be a tipping point after or beyond which most of us tend to adopt let's say behavior. But unfortunately, if you're in a very dense population, there's more people around you, so there's more people required to change to get or to reach the tipping point. Okay, so you have to convince, if you're the change agent, you have to convince more people to change before you achieve that tipping point within the group. On the other hand, if you look at maybe the edges of the system, what you find there is people are less connected. So you have to convince, as the change agent, you have to convince less people to hit a tipping point within clusters before the rest of the people then adopt a change. So it's far more effective to start really to introducing change at the edges of an organization or a system. And that's what the likes of Damon Santola found, that when you look at these large scale system changes, you find that the change spreads across the edges before it moves into the center. And that's why, I suppose, I would particularly advocate that people start with the edges, and that would grow change from the edges. Also, it's very difficult to change for those reasons and others, to change large scale, maybe monolithic type organizations, very strong cultures. It's very difficult to change them from the center out. However, it may be more effective to think of it as about growing subcultures, growing change, and then letting it in time transplant the dominant culture, the dominant center of the organization. And I suppose this also explains why earlier I was talking about the idea of the edge effect. Um, um, and I suppose for me, the edge effect can be found, for example, in organizations along the boundary of the organization between the internal and the external. But I suppose in nature, the edge is found generally where you have two or more ecosystems come together. And at that point, we know there are areas of max diversity. Generally, you'll find ideas, let's say you have two ecosystems together, you'll find ideas from the first ecosystem, ideas from the second ecosystem, but also new ideas that emerge from the overlapping of ideas from either ecosystem. So you tend to have these areas of max diversity at the edges. Also, of course, if you're at the edge, you're away from the dominant logic maybe of the core of a system. So you tend to have more freedom to do new things. Definitely more freedom than you would have it with closer to the center of the ecosystem. So that's again a second reason. And I suppose there are other reasons to know, but they would be very, very strong reasons why we should look at maybe the likes of edge theory. Also, of course, for the reasons that, complex contagion, that generally change will spread quicker within at the edges, as I said, because of reasons like of Damon Santola, etc. Gave. So I think we need to look at transformation very differently to the way we look at it at the moment. We should be looking at it from the point of view, trying to transform and pilot change from the edges. So instead of strategy driving transformation, I feel transformation should be driving strategy, that we learn from what's happening at the edges, piloting change at the edges, depending on what works, then we create strategy or inform strategy based on that. So look, there are some of the reasons I would advocate this approach. I think there's lots of evidence also within organizations that that this is the way change happens. I know we look at the likes of the adoption of Agile within Microsoft, the adoption of maybe DevOps in various organizations, where we see it happening this way. It starts locally within certain teams first, it contagious to neighboring teams, and then eventually you hit a tipping point where it becomes nearly part of the dominant logic. So lots of reasons, I think, for looking at transformation differently. And just one final point on it, and I know, I suppose I'm going to call it a bit of whitewashing. I think there's a lot of approaches now where I suppose we're starting to call them more human-centered. For me, in transformation, there is a move about including people more, but in some cases, just gathering information, insights from people isn't enough, because what's happening is we're gathering those insights, we are still bringing it to the top of an organization and then push it back down again. Whereas I think an alternative approach is letting, I suppose, the decision makers and the action takers become the one group, or at least cut out the big divide between decision makers and action takers, where the people making decisions are closer to those taking the actions. So again, an argument for starting change locally, where the decision makers that can make those decisions locally are also very close to the action takers. So you're cutting out, I suppose, that big distance that happens in lots of organizations, where you could have 5, 6, 7 levels between those maybe at the edges having to implement change, and those making the decisions. And very often information isn't going up and decisions are very slow coming back down. So again, I'd be advocating we collapse that distance. But look, we could talk about this for ages, but they're just maybe some of my thoughts around why I would have said what I said earlier. Thank you.